They hated each other so much that the whole town once bet $5 they would never stand under the same roof without arguing. Yet a year later, Ethan Cole and Clara Whitmore walked out of the same church as husband and wife. Dustfall Creek was the kind of place where dust hung in the air like old memories, and everybody knew everybody's business before the sun reached noon. And if there was one story folks never got tired of telling, it was the feud between the quiet cowboy with the weather-beaten hat and the rancher's daughter with the sharp gray eyes. Ethan Cole rode into town most mornings with the slow patience of a man who had learned not to rush the desert wind. His boots were worn, his coat smelled faintly of horse leather and cedar smoke, and he spoke little unless someone asked him a straight question. Clara Whitmore was the opposite in every way that mattered. She moved through Dustfall Creek like she owned the ground under every boot in town. Chin high, shoulders straight, a woman raised on hard land and harder pride. Their story went back farther than most people remembered, all the way to when they were kids racing along the dry creek bed behind their father's fences. Something happened back then, some argument between the families, some old misunderstanding about land and livestock, and from that day forward the two of them grew up, like rival storms rolling across the same horizon. By the time they were adults, the tension had become part of town life. If Ethan tied his horse outside the general store, Clara would walk out the other door. If Clara arrived at the church steps, Ethan would lean against the hitching rail across the street and wait for the dust to settle. People joked about it over coffee and pie. Some said they fought like siblings. Others said they carried a grudge older than the railroad tracks that ran 10 miles south of town. But the moment everyone remembered happened one late summer evening inside the saloon on Main Street. The lanterns were glowing amber against the wooden walls. A piano was playing slow and tired in the corner, and the smell of whiskey drifted through the open doors into the warm desert air. Ethan stepped inside to escape the heat. Clara was already there, standing at the bar with her, back straight as a fence post. The room fell quiet the way it does when thunder rolls across open land. For a second, neither of them spoke. Then Clara turned, eyes cold as winter creek water, and slid her glass across the counter so it stopped right in front of his boots. "If the devil ever needs a bride," she said, loud enough for the whole saloon to hear, "he'll come looking for you first, Ethan Cole." A few men chuckled nervously. Ethan looked down at the glass, then back at her, calm as a man watching distant lightning. He tipped his hat once and said only 4 words. "Not if you're available." The room erupted in laughter, but the look they shared in that moment was not humor. It was history. Old, stubborn history baked into the dry soil of Dustfall Creek. And none of those men laughing that night had any idea that before the next year was over, the very same 2 people who could barely stand the sight of each other would be standing side by side inside the little white church at the edge of town, saying vows neither of them had ever planned to speak. Long before the arguments in the saloon and the cold glances across Main Street, there had been 2 children running along the dry creek bed outside Dustfall Creek, their boots kicking up pale dust under the wide Texas sky. Ethan Cole was 10 years old then, skinny and quiet, the kind of boy who listened more than he spoke. Clara Whitmore was 9 and already carried herself like someone twice her age, with a stubborn chin and eyes that never backed down from a challenge. Their fathers owned neighboring land on the edge of town, separated by a long wooden fence that stretched nearly half a mile across the prairie. In those early days the fence was nothing more than a line between 2 pastures, and the children often slipped through the loose boards to explore the same fields together. They raced horses that were barely tall enough to carry them, climbed the old cottonwood tree near the creek, and skipped stones across the shallow water that only flowed after spring rain. For a while it seemed like the 2 families shared the same horizon. But the land out west has a way of testing people, and one dry summer changed everything. The rain stopped coming that year. Grass turned the color of old straw, and the creek shrank until it was little more than a ribbon of muddy water twisting through cracked earth. Ranchers began arguing quietly about wells, pasture lines, and which cattle had wandered where. One evening a dispute broke out near the fence between the Whitmore land and the Cole pasture. The adults spoke in low voices at first, the way people do when pride keeps them from stepping back. Young Ethan watched from the porch of his family cabin. Clara stood beside the barn across the field, her small hands gripping the wooden rail. No one in town ever agreed on the exact details of what happened next. Some said it was a misunderstanding about a frightened horse. Others said it was simply bad luck in a season already filled with it. What everyone remembered was the silence afterward. The next morning, the Whitmore family moved their herd to the far side of their land and closed the old fence gate that had always been left open. Clara no longer crossed the boards to the creek. Ethan no longer waited by the cottonwood tree. When the two children saw each other in town weeks later, the distance between them felt wider than the prairie itself. Clara looked at him as if he carried the blame for something she could not forgive. Ethan did not argue. He simply tipped his head slightly, the same quiet gesture he would use years later as a grown man. From that day forward, the two families lived side by side like strangers who shared the same wind, but not the same trust. The children grew older, the fence grew stronger, and the open gate between the pastures remained shut. Dustfall Creek moved on with its harvest seasons and cattle drives, but the story of that dry summer stayed buried in the soil. What began as a misunderstanding slowly hardened into something colder, something that followed Ethan Cole and Clara Whitmore through every year that came after, shaping the way they spoke to each other, the way they avoided the same streets, and the way the entire town learned to expect sparks whenever those two names appeared in the same sentence. By the time Ethan Cole and Clara Whitmore were grown, the quiet distance between their families had turned into something the whole town recognized the moment it walked through the door of any room. Dustfall Creek was not a large place. On most mornings, the same handful of wagons rolled slowly along Main Street, and the same horses were tied to the wooden rail outside the general store. The barber knew every story before the second cup of coffee, and the church bell on Sunday carried across nearly every acre of land for miles around. In a town like that, grudges did not stay private for long. People watched the way Ethan kept his hat low when he rode past the Whitmore Ranch Road. They noticed how Clara chose the opposite side of the street if she saw his horse tied outside the post office. It was never loud at first, just small things that added up like dry sticks before a campfire spark. At the livestock market one autumn afternoon, a rancher jokingly asked Ethan if he planned to bid on a group of young horses Clara had brought in from her father's pasture. Ethan looked at the animals for a moment, then calmly shook his head and said he preferred stock that did not already belong to someone who disliked him. The men around the rail chuckled quietly, because everyone understood exactly who he meant. A few weeks later at the church harvest gathering, Clara stood beside the long wooden table where pies cooled in the evening air. Someone mentioned that Ethan had repaired the old windmill on the North Road after a storm knocked part of it loose. Clara listened without smiling and said that some men liked fixing windmills because they could not fix the trouble they caused years earlier. Conversations like that traveled across Dustfall Creek faster than a prairie wind. The town began to treat the tension between them almost like weather. If Ethan stepped into the saloon, a few people would glance toward the door to see whether Clara might appear next. If Clara arrived at the general store, someone inevitably wondered aloud how long it would be before Ethan rode past the window. Strangely enough, neither of them seemed interested in making a spectacle. Ethan remained quiet, steady in his routines, riding out at sunrise and returning with the same slow patience of a man who believed that time solved more problems than arguments. Clara worked her family land with equal determination, managing cattle, repairing fences, and speaking with the confidence of someone who refused to let hardship weaken her pride. Yet the old story between their families hung in the air like dust after a wagon rolled through town. Some folks believed the disagreement had simply lasted too long to ever fade away. Others said the two of them carried the weight of something they barely remembered themselves. What nobody realized then was that the land surrounding Dustfall Creek was about to face another dry season far worse than the one from their childhood. And when the rain stopped falling again, the same history that had kept Ethan Cole and Clara Whitmore apart for years would quietly push their lives onto a road neither of them had expected to walk. The year the rain stopped returning to Dustfall Creek began quietly, the way trouble often does out on the prairie. At first it was only a few dry weeks stretching longer than usual. The creek behind the cottonwood tree slowed until its water moved like tired glass over smooth stones. The grass that once brushed against a rider's boots began turning pale under the steady sun, and the wind carried the smell of dry earth across miles of pasture. Ranchers noticed the change in small ways. Cattle walked farther between patches of green. Wooden buckets at the wells lowered deeper than they had the year before. Old men standing outside the general store started glancing toward the sky more often, as if clouds might suddenly appear out of respect for their patience. But the clouds never came. By midsummer, the fields around Dustfall Creek looked like a faded photograph of better seasons. Fences cast long, thin shadows across ground that had begun to crack in quiet lines. Every rancher in the valley understood what that meant. When the land stopped feeding the cattle stopped feeding the families who depended on them. Clara Whitmore felt the change sooner than most. The Whitmore Ranch stretched across nearly 300 acres west of town, land her father had spent a lifetime building into one of the strongest herds in the county. After he passed away 3 years earlier, Clara had taken responsibility for the entire place herself. She rose before sunrise every morning, rode the pasture lines, checked water troughs, and kept careful track of every calf and every bale of hay stacked in the barn. Pride kept her moving even when the work grew heavier than one person should carry alone. But pride could not bring rain. By late August, the pastures on Whitmore land had thinned enough that Clara began buying extra feed from suppliers 20 miles away. The cost added up quickly. A few payments at the bank in town became several, and the friendly tone the banker once used slowly turned more formal each time she stepped through the office door. Dustfall Creek did not miss the change. People noticed Clara riding harder than usual, dust trailing behind her horse along the county road. They saw the tired look in her eyes when she stopped at the general store for supplies. What most people did not notice was the man who quietly observed all of it from a distance. Ethan Cole rode his usual routes through the hills north of town, checking fences and watching over the modest herd he managed on his own land. He spoke little about other people's business, but he understood the land well enough to read its warnings. One evening, as the sun dropped low behind the dry fields, Ethan paused on a ridge that overlooked the Whitmore pasture. From that distance, he could see the cattle scattered thin across the yellow grass and the empty stretch of sky above them where rain should have been forming. The wind carried dust across the valley in slow, drifting lines. Ethan adjusted the brim of his hat and studied the land for a long moment, the same quiet patience in his posture that the town had come to expect from him. What nobody in Dustfall Creek knew yet was that the bank had already begun calculating how long the Whitmore Ranch could survive another season like this. And before the first cold wind of autumn arrived, a decision made in a small office on Main Street would push Ethan Cole and Clara Whitmore closer together than either of them had ever imagined. The first official warning arrived on a quiet afternoon when the wind barely moved the dust along Main Street. Clara Whitmore tied her horse outside the bank, brushed the dry trail from her coat, and stepped through the door with the same steady confidence she carried everywhere in Dustfall Creek. The office inside smelled faintly of paper, ink, and the warm wood of old desks that had seen decades of ranchers come and go. Behind the counter sat Mr. Harold Bennett, the banker who had known Clara since she was a child running errands for her father. He greeted her politely, but the careful tone in his voice told her the visit would not be a friendly one. Clara sat across from his desk, while sunlight slipped through the tall window and stretched across the floorboards. Mr. Bennett opened a ledger, adjusted his spectacles, and spoke in the slow, measured way of a man delivering news he wished he did not have to explain. The cost of feed had risen again. The account attached to the Whitmore Ranch had grown heavier with each passing month. The bank had allowed extensions before because of respect for her father and the strength the ranch once represented. But times had changed. If the remaining balance could not be resolved before the end of the season, the bank would be forced to reclaim the land and sell it to cover the debt. Clara listened without interrupting, her hands folded calmly in her lap, even though the words landed like cold wind against her pride. 300 acres of pasture. The barns her father built with his own hands. The old house standing against the western horizon. Every inch of it was tied to her name now, and the idea of losing it sat heavy in the quiet office. When the banker finished speaking, he slid a paper across the desk. It was not a threat, only a notice explaining what might happen if the payment stopped. Clara glanced at the document, then slowly pushed it back. She said she would find a way to settle the account. Mr. Bennett nodded, though his expression suggested he had already seen too many ranchers promise the same thing during dry years. Clara left the bank and stepped into the afternoon sunlight, where the town carried on as usual. A wagon rolled past the general store. A group of ranch hands laughed outside the barber shop. Life moved the same as it always had, but Clara felt the weight of the banker's words pressing quietly against her thoughts. What she did not notice was the man standing across the street beside the hitching rail. Ethan Cole had arrived in town an hour earlier to collect supplies. He watched Clara walk toward her horse, her shoulders straight despite the long shadow of worry that now followed her. Ethan said nothing. He simply studied the scene the way a rancher studies a distant storm forming along the horizon. The bank window reflected the bright afternoon sun behind him, and for a moment the entire street stood silent except for the soft creak of leather saddles shifting in the warm breeze. Clara mounted her horse and rode west toward the Whitmore land without looking back. Ethan remained where he was, his hat low over thoughtful eyes. Somewhere between the dry fields and the quiet office she had just left, a path had begun forming that would soon force the two most stubborn people in Dustfall Creek to face a choice neither of them had ever expected to consider. The sun had already dropped low behind the western hills when Clara Whitmore returned to her ranch that evening, and the long shadows across the pasture made the land look even thinner than it had that morning. The cattle moved slowly through the dry grass, their heads lowered as they searched for anything green left beneath the fading light. Clara rode along the fence line in silence, counting them the way she always did, but the numbers in her mind no longer brought the same steady confidence they once had. Every bale of feed she purchased meant another dollar owed. Every week, without rain, pushed the Whitmore ranch a little closer to the edge the banker had quietly described. The wind carried dust across the fields, brushing against the wooden boards of the old barn her father built years ago. Clara dismounted and stood beside the fence for a long moment, staring across the land that had shaped her entire life. Pride told her she could outwork any hardship, but even pride could not turn dry earth into grass. The next morning she rode into Dustfall Creek earlier than usual, hoping to speak with a supplier who sometimes brought feed from farms farther east. The town was still waking. The bakery door had just opened, and the smell of fresh bread drifted into the cool air. A wagon creaked slowly past the post office. Clara stepped into the general store and spent nearly an hour discussing prices and delivery routes with the store owner, trying to calculate how many more weeks she could stretch her remaining savings. When she finally stepped back outside, the sun had climbed high enough to warm the wooden boardwalk. That was when she saw Ethan Cole standing near the hitching rail across the street. He had finished loading a small sack of supplies onto his saddle and appeared ready to leave, but he paused when their eyes met. For a moment neither of them spoke. Years of stubborn silence hung between them like the dry wind drifting down Main Street. Clara expected him to tip his hat and ride away as usual. Instead, Ethan walked slowly across the road until he stopped a few feet from where she stood. His voice was calm, almost thoughtful, as if he had spent more time considering this moment than anyone in town could guess. He asked her how the Whitmore ranch was holding up during the drought. Clara stiffened at the question. She answered that her land was none of his concern. Ethan nodded once, as though he had expected the reply. He studied the quiet street for a moment, then looked back at her with the same steady expression he carried everywhere. When he finally spoke again, the words were simple but strange enough that Clara felt the air around them grow suddenly still. Ethan said there might be a way for her to keep the ranch even if the bank decided to collect its debt. Clara narrowed her eyes, unsure whether to treat the idea as a joke or an insult. The two of them had disagreed about nearly everything for most of their lives. The thought that he might now be offering help sounded almost impossible. Ethan did not smile or explain further. He only said that if she was willing to listen, he had a proposal that could settle the bank account and keep the Whitmore land exactly where it had always been. Clara folded her arms, the old stubborn fire rising behind her calm expression. She asked him why he would ever involve himself in a problem that did not belong to him. Ethan glanced toward the distant hills beyond town, where the dry fields stretched under the bright sky. Then he returned his attention to her and said something that no one in Dustfall Creek would have believed if they had heard it spoken aloud. He said the solution was simple. All she had to do was marry him. For a moment Clara Whitmore was certain she had heard him wrong. The afternoon wind drifted slowly down Main Street, lifting a thin line of dust along the wooden boardwalk, and the quiet between them stretched long enough that a wagon rolling past the far end of town sounded unusually loud. Clara stared at Ethan Cole as if the words he had just spoken belonged to someone else entirely. Marry him. Of all the things she expected to hear from the man who had spent half a lifetime on the opposite side of every argument, that was the one possibility she had never imagined. Her first reaction came quickly, sharp and immediate. The same stubborn fire that had carried her through every challenge since she took over the Whitmore Ranch. She told him the idea was ridiculous. She reminded him that the entire town knew they could barely stand the sight of each other. She said that if he believed she would solve her problems by agreeing to something so absurd, then he clearly did not understand her at all. Ethan did not argue. He stood there with the same steady patience he carried on every long ride across the prairie. When she finished speaking, he simply nodded once and explained the proposal more clearly. The bank, he said, was willing to extend certain ranch accounts if two properties were legally connected under a single household. It was an old policy meant to protect family land during difficult seasons. If Clara married him, even temporarily, the Whitmore Ranch would qualify for the extension. The debt would be postponed until the drought passed and the cattle market improved. Clara folded her arms tighter as she listened. The explanation sounded logical, almost simple, but the thought of tying her name to Ethan Cole's even for a short time felt like standing at the edge of a canyon with no clear path across. She asked how long he expected such an arrangement to last. Ethan answered that 1 year would be enough. A single year of legal marriage would allow the ranch to recover, and after that they could end the agreement quietly with no further obligation. Clara searched his face for any sign of mockery or hidden amusement. She found none. His expression remained calm, serious, almost practical, as if he were discussing the repair of a broken fence, rather than the future of two lives that had spent decades moving in opposite directions. The silence between them grew heavier with every passing second. Across the street, the door of the general store creaked open, and a few townspeople stepped outside, glancing casually toward the pair standing near the hitching rail. They could not hear the conversation, but curiosity traveled easily in a place as small as Dustfall Creek. Clara lowered her voice and asked the question that had been building in her mind since the moment he spoke the word marriage. She asked why he would do this at all. The drought affected everyone, but it was her ranch facing the bank, not his. Ethan looked down the empty road for a moment, watching the wind move across the dry valley beyond town. When he finally answered, his voice remained quiet and steady. He said that some land deserved a chance to survive a hard season. Clara felt the weight of those words settle into the space between them. The offer still sounded impossible. Yet somewhere behind her stubborn pride was the quiet truth she had been trying to ignore since leaving the bank office. Without help, the Whitmore Ranch might not see another spring. Clara Whitmore did not answer him right away. The afternoon sun had shifted higher above Dustfall Creek, casting bright light across the wooden storefronts and the quiet road that stretched through town like a pale ribbon of dust. She stood beside her horse with her arms folded, staring at Ethan Cole as if the proposal still had not fully settled in her mind. A year of marriage to the one man she had spent most of her life arguing with sounded less like a solution and more like a story someone in the saloon might invent after a long evening. Yet the bank papers waiting on the desk in Mr. Bennett's office were real, and the dry wind moving across the valley was not about to change simply because pride told her it should. Clara finally spoke, her voice lower now, careful and measured. She said that even if the bank allowed such an arrangement, the town would talk about it for years. Dustfall Creek had never seen the two of them agree on anything. The idea of them suddenly sharing a household would become the only subject at every table in town. Ethan answered with a quiet shrug. He said people in small towns always talked, and the wind carried their stories away eventually. Clara studied him again, trying to understand the calm certainty in his tone. She asked what exactly he expected from this arrangement besides a signature on a marriage license. Ethan explained that the agreement would remain simple. They would marry legally, long enough for the bank to secure both properties under one account. Clara could continue running the Whitmore Ranch exactly as she always had. Ethan would remain on his land north of town most days. The only real change would be on paper and in the eyes of the bank. After 1 year, once the drought eased and the cattle market stabilized, they would end the arrangement quietly. No arguments, no obligations beyond the agreement itself. Clara looked down the empty road where the prairie stretched toward the western hills. A single year sounded both short and impossibly long at the same time. 1 year tied to the man she had blamed for half the bitterness in her life. Yet behind that thought was the image of the Whitmore house, standing alone against the dry pasture, the barn her father built, and the cattle still grazing beneath the fading grass. Pride told her to refuse. Responsibility whispered something different. She turned back toward Ethan, her expression still guarded. She said she would need proof that the bank would truly accept such an arrangement. Ethan nodded as if he had already expected that answer. He told her to meet him at the bank office the following morning. Mr. Bennett had already agreed to explain the policy himself. Clara felt a quiet jolt of surprise at that detail. The fact that Ethan had spoken with the banker before approaching her meant he had planned this conversation long before it happened on the street. She mounted her horse slowly, the leather saddle creaking beneath her weight. For a moment she hesitated, looking down at him from the saddle. Dustfall Creek continued moving around them, wagons rolling past, and townspeople drifting in and out of the shops. Yet in the middle of that ordinary afternoon, something unexpected had begun to shift between two people who had spent years standing on opposite sides of every road in town. Clara finally turned the reins toward the west road leading back to her ranch. As she rode away through the drifting dust, the thought followed her across the dry fields. By the next morning, she would have to decide whether saving the Whitmore land was worth accepting the strangest proposal Dustfall Creek had ever seen. The next morning arrived cool and quiet over Dustfall Creek, the kind of early prairie morning when the sky looks wide and pale before the sun fully climbs above the hills. Clara Whitmore rode into town just after sunrise, her horse moving at a steady pace along the same road she had traveled hundreds of times before. But this morning felt different. Every turn of the trail carried the weight of a decision she had never imagined making. The Whitmore ranch stretched behind her across 300 dry acres, the fences standing strong even while the grass beneath them faded under the stubborn drought. She had spent most of the night awake on the front porch, listening to the wind move across the empty pasture and thinking about the proposal Ethan Cole had placed in front of her like a strange tool she had never learned how to use. When the bank building came into view at the end of Main Street, she slowed her horse. The town had barely started its day. A few shopkeepers were sweeping their doorsteps. The bakery window glowed warm with fresh bread inside. The rest of the street remained quiet except for one familiar figure standing near the hitching rail beside the bank steps. Ethan Cole had arrived earlier and waited with the calm patience that seemed to follow him everywhere. When Clara dismounted, he tipped his hat in greeting but did not speak. Together they stepped into the bank office where Mr. Harold Bennett was already seated behind his desk with a ledger open in front of him. The banker greeted them both politely, though his eyebrows lifted slightly at the unusual sight of the two standing side by side in his office. Clara wasted no time with small talk. She asked him directly whether the policy Ethan mentioned the day before was real. Mr. Bennett folded his hands on the desk and explained it carefully. During difficult seasons, the bank sometimes allowed two ranch properties to combine under a single household account if the owners were legally married. The arrangement created additional security for the loan and gave the bank confidence that the land would survive long enough for the market to recover. Clara listened closely, searching his voice for any hint that the idea might be a misunderstanding. But the banker spoke plainly. If she married Ethan Cole, the Whitmore debt could be postponed for 1 full year while the drought passed and the cattle market improved. Without that arrangement, the bank would likely move forward with reclaiming the land before winter. The room fell quiet after his explanation. Clara looked at the ledger on the desk as if the numbers inside it carried the future of every fence and pasture on her ranch. Then she glanced toward Ethan. He remained silent, his posture relaxed, leaving the decision entirely in her hands. For a moment, the memories of their long history flickered through her mind like distant lightning across the prairie. Years of arguments. Years of stubborn distance. Yet here they were standing in the same office facing the same piece of paper that could either save or end the Whitmore ranch. Clara finally drew a slow breath and straightened her shoulders. She told Mr. Bennett that if the bank truly honored the policy he described, then she was willing to accept the arrangement. The banker nodded once and reached for a document from the corner of his desk. As the pen slid across the paper toward her waiting hand, Clara Whitmore realized that by the end of the day, she would be stepping onto a road that no one in Dustfall Creek had ever expected her to walk beside Ethan Cole. The pen rested on the desk between Clara Whitmore and the paper that would change the direction of her life. Morning light streamed through the tall bank window, falling across the polished wood and the open ledger where numbers and signatures had decided the fate of ranches for decades. Outside, Dustfall Creek continued waking slowly, unaware that inside the quiet office two of its most stubborn residents were about to do something the town had never imagined. Clara picked up the pen and studied the document once more. The words were plain and formal, written in the careful language of legal agreements. A temporary marriage, a shared household account, 1 year of combined property responsibility. After that, both parties would be free to return to their separate lives. She had faced difficult choices before, but none quite like this. The Whitmore Ranch was more than land. It was every sunrise ride across the pasture, every fence post her father had set in the ground, every winter evening spent repairing barns while the wind rattled the shutters. Losing it would feel like erasing an entire chapter of her family's history. Clara signed her name with a steady hand. The ink dried quickly in the warm room. Mr. Bennett nodded once and slid the paper toward Ethan. Without hesitation, Ethan Cole added his signature beneath hers. The banker closed the ledger and said that the town clerk could arrange the legal ceremony that afternoon. The entire process would be simple and quiet. Clara placed the pen back on the desk and stood slowly, still adjusting to the strange reality forming around her. Ethan stepped aside so she could pass, his calm expression unchanged as if this decision were simply another practical step on a long trail. Word travels fast in a place like Dustfall Creek, and by the time the afternoon sun began lowering toward the western hills, a small crowd had gathered near the white wooden church at the edge of town. People stood along the walkway and leaned against the fence posts, whispering to one another with a mixture of curiosity and disbelief. They had watched Ethan Cole and Clara Whitmore avoid each other for years. Now they had come to see whether the story spreading across town could possibly be true. Clara arrived first, riding her horse up the church path while the quiet murmurs followed her every step. She dismounted without looking at the crowd and walked toward the front door with her usual steady confidence. A few minutes later, Ethan rode up from the opposite direction and tied his horse beside the hitching rail. The two of them entered the small church together beneath the soft creak of the wooden doors. Inside, the air smelled faintly of old pine benches and candle wax. The town clerk stood near the front with a simple document ready for signatures. There were no flowers, no music, no celebration waiting inside those walls. Only the quiet echo of boots across the floorboards and the curious eyes of a few witnesses who had been invited to make the ceremony official. Clara and Ethan stood side by side at the front of the room. For a brief moment neither spoke, both aware that every road they had walked before this day had somehow led them here. When the clerk began reading the vows, the words sounded calm and ordinary, yet they carried the weight of a decision that would reshape the next year of both their lives. And as Clara Whitmore listened to those words echo through the small church, she realized that saving the Whitmore Ranch had already started to change something deeper than the future of her land. The vows ended quietly inside the small wooden church, the final words echoing softly against the high ceiling before fading into the still afternoon air. Clara Whitmore and Ethan Cole stood side by side at the front, the same distance apart they had kept for most of their lives, yet now bound by a single signature that carried more weight than either of them had expected. The town clerk folded the document carefully and announced the marriage in a calm voice that sounded almost ordinary for such an unusual moment. A few witnesses nodded politely, unsure whether they had just watched a practical arrangement or the beginning of something no one in Dustfall Creek understood yet. Outside the church, the late afternoon sun had turned the sky pale gold above the valley. The small crowd waiting near the fence straightened as the doors opened, and the two newly married ranchers stepped out onto the wooden porch. For a moment the quiet was almost complete. Then whispers drifted through the gathering like wind across dry grass. Some people looked amused. Others looked puzzled. A few older ranchers simply tipped their hats in respectful silence, understanding that out west sometimes people made decisions the rest of the world could not easily explain. Clara walked down the short path toward her horse without looking at anyone. Ethan followed a few steps behind, his calm expression unchanged. When they reached the hitching rail, Clara paused and finally turned toward him. She reminded him that the agreement lasted 1 year and nothing more. The Whitmore Ranch would remain under her management. She would continue living on her land and running her cattle exactly as she always had. Ethan nodded once and answered that he expected nothing different. He said the paperwork would satisfy the bank, and the rest of their lives could remain simple and separate. Clara studied his face for a moment, searching for any sign that he might be joking about a situation that had already become the most talked about story in town. But Ethan only adjusted the reins of his horse and glanced out toward the wide valley beyond Dustfall Creek, where the dry wind continued to sweep across the fading pasture. They mounted their horses almost at the same time. Clara rode west toward the Whitmore Ranch, while Ethan turned north toward his own land. Anyone watching from the church fence might have thought nothing had changed at all. 2 riders leaving town in opposite directions, just as they had done for years. Yet the truth was written quietly in the ledger back at the bank and in the document now resting in the clerk's office. For the next year, their names were tied together in the eyes of the law and the land. As Clara rode across the long stretch of road leading back to her ranch, the evening light spread across the prairie like a slow-moving tide of gold. She could see the roof of the Whitmore house waiting on the horizon and the tall barn standing beside it, stubborn against the drought just like the woman who refused to abandon it. Saving the ranch had required a decision she never imagined making. What Clara Whitmore did not realize yet was that the agreement she had just accepted would soon reveal truths about the past she had carried for years without ever hearing the full story. Days passed quietly after the unusual wedding in Dustfall Creek, yet the story traveled through the town faster than the wind across the valley. Ranchers discussed it beside watering troughs, shopkeepers whispered about it across wooden counters, and every porch conversation eventually circled back to the same unlikely question of how Clara Whitmore and Ethan Cole had ended up legally married after years of sharp distance. Clara ignored the talk as best she could. Her mornings still began before sunrise on the Whitmore Ranch, riding the pasture lines while the cool air carried the faint scent of dry grass and dust. The drought had not ended simply because a paper had been signed in town. The cattle still needed feed. The fences still needed repair. Every acre still demanded the same stubborn work she had given it for years. Yet something else had begun to shift in ways she did not expect. 3 days after the ceremony, Clara noticed fresh boards reinforcing the old north fence where the wind had loosened several posts. She had planned to repair that section herself later in the week, but the work was already finished by the time she rode past it. No one from town had been hired, and none of her usual helpers had mentioned stopping by. The following morning, she discovered the broken hinge on the large barn gate had been replaced with a new iron bracket. The metal still shone faintly in the early light, a quiet sign that someone had fixed it only hours earlier. Clara stood beside the gate and studied the repair in silence. It was strong work, careful and clean, done by someone who understood ranch equipment well. She did not need to ask who had done it. That evening, as the sun sank low over the prairie, Clara rode into Dustfall Creek for supplies. The street was calmer than usual, though a few curious glances followed her horse as she tied the reins outside the general store. When she stepped back into the fading light with a small sack of feed grain over her shoulder, she saw Ethan standing beside his own horse across the street. He appeared ready to leave town, just as she had finished her errand. For a moment, the two simply looked at each other across the dusty road. Clara walked over slowly and set the sack on her saddle. Then she spoke the question that had been sitting in her thoughts since she discovered the repaired fence that morning. She asked him if he had been riding near the Whitmore pasture during the last few nights. Ethan rested one hand on the saddle horn and nodded without hesitation. He explained that since their marriage had combined the properties on paper, the bank might inspect the land during the drought. If the fences and structures showed neglect, the extension could be reconsidered. Clara listened carefully to his explanation. It sounded practical enough, yet she knew that the bank rarely inspected ranches so quickly. Ethan did not wait for further questions. He mounted his horse and tipped his hat slightly, the same quiet gesture he had used years ago when they were children standing on opposite sides of a wooden fence. Clara watched him ride north out of town while the evening wind carried long shadows across the valley. Saving the Whitmore Ranch had begun as a simple agreement on paper, But now the quiet actions behind that agreement were starting to reveal something she had never noticed before. The man she had spent years blaming for an old family conflict was quietly working to protect the very land she believed he once helped put at risk. Autumn arrived slowly across the valley outside Dustfall Creek, and with it came the first real clouds the sky had carried in months. The drought had not vanished overnight, but the land was beginning to breathe again. A few thin patches of green had returned along the creek bed, and the cattle on the Whitmore ranch no longer wandered quite as far in search of grass. Clara Whitmore noticed the changes during her early morning rides, when the horizon glowed pale gold and the wind carried a cooler edge across the prairie. For nearly a year, the strange arrangement with Ethan Cole had existed quietly in the background of their lives. The bank kept the Whitmore account open, just as promised. The ranch survived the hardest season it had faced in decades. And through all those months, Ethan never asked for anything in return. He rode past the Whitmore land often, sometimes repairing a loose fence board or replacing a weathered hinge before Clara even noticed it needed attention. He never mentioned the work. He simply did it and continued on his way across the valley. At first, Clara treated those quiet gestures like a necessary part of the agreement. But as the months passed, she began to understand that Ethan had been protecting the ranch long before the paper marriage existed. One evening near the end of the dry season, she found the answer she had carried for years without knowing it. While cleaning an old storage chest inside the barn, Clara discovered a small leather journal that once belonged to her father. The pages inside held simple records of cattle numbers and rainfall dates, but one entry near the back caught her attention. It described the summer of the old dispute between the Whitmore and Cole families, the very day the fence gate had been closed and the friendship between two neighboring ranches quietly ended. Her father had written that the accident with the frightened horse had never been Ethan's fault. In fact, Ethan's father had stepped in to help calm the animal when it panicked near the fence line. The misunderstanding had grown from pride and silence, not from wrongdoing. Clara read the entry twice before closing the journal slowly. For years she had carried anger toward a man who had never caused the trouble she believed he did. The truth settled into her thoughts like rain finally reaching dry ground. The following afternoon, Clara rode north toward Ethan's land where he was repairing a water trough beside a small windmill. The breeze moved gently across the hills, carrying the quiet sound of turning blades overhead. Ethan looked up as her horse approached, but said nothing, waiting the same way he always had. Clara dismounted and stood beside the fence for a long moment, the old journal entry still clear in her mind. She told him she had learned the truth about the past, and that the years of distance between them had begun with a misunderstanding no one ever corrected. Ethan listened without interrupting. When she finished speaking, he simply rested his hands on the fence rail and looked out across the valley where both of their lands stretched beneath the wide sky. Clara then reminded him that the one-year agreement with the bank was almost over. The document allowing them to end the marriage sat ready at the clerk's office in town. Ethan nodded calmly and said that a deal was a deal. If she wished to sign the paper, he would meet her there whenever she chose. The windmill creaked softly above them, while Clara studied the quiet man who had spent an entire year protecting land that once blamed him for a mistake he never made. After a long moment, she reached into her saddlebag and removed the folded paper from the clerk's office. Ethan assumed it was the document ending their arrangement. Clara held it for a second, then calmly tore the paper in half and let the pieces drift into the prairie wind. Ethan looked at her with quiet surprise for the first time since the day they met as children beside the old fence line. Clara rested one hand on the rail and said that the ranch was finally strong again and the drought was ending. There was no longer any reason for the agreement to continue. But some decisions were not made for the bank or the town. Some were made because the truth had finally been heard. Ethan watched the last piece of paper disappear across the grass while the windmill turned slowly against the evening sky. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Out on the western land where dust and pride had shaped their lives for years, the silence between them no longer felt like distance. It felt like the beginning of something honest that had been waiting a long time to be understood.